Hello everyone, and welcome to the Darkest Hour. I'm your host, Amanda Jane. Hospitals. Sure, they aren't always places we want to be, but if it means saving our lives or bettering our health, it's usually the place you've got to be. They serve their purpose, and for the most part, they're a place for healing. Still, they're scary for various reasons. Though tonight we focus on the fact that they also seem to be places where the living and the departed are separated only by a thin veil, creating an atmosphere where the boundary between the two is incredibly fragile or easily crossed. Spirits of the departed able to make their presence known to the living, whether through apparitions, paranormal activity, or other phenomena. The veil is not absolute or impenetrable. In these encounters, and others like them, are they mere coincidences, random and disconnected? Or were we meant to experience certain things, the idea of fate and destiny playing a role, that there's something deeper we can't always see? So, let's get started, shall we? I worked as a cook at a hospital. The kitchen facility was always dark, and I was usually alone when I got there. It was an eerie feeling, being the first one to arrive, prepare breakfast in a dimly lit space, but I never thought much of it until one morning, when things took a turn. As I started to prepare the food, I noticed that items I needed were mysteriously going missing. It felt as though someone was playing a trick on me, moving things around when I wasn't looking, but I was alone. Still, I called out, searching the kitchen, but no one was there. Eventually, I brushed it off as my own mistake, absent-mindedness. But the strange occurrences continued. They happened every day. I was beginning to feel frustrated while also rather unnerved. So, I decided to mentally mark the location of each item before taking my eyes off of them. To my surprise, even with being constantly vigilant, the items still went missing or were misplaced. It became clear that something was trying to communicate something with me, but I couldn't comprehend the intentions. One day, I guess I was visibly distressed or more distracted than usual. A coworker, who's also a friend, noticed and asked what was going on. I hesitantly shared my experiences, and to my relief, she responded and said, "It's happening to you too?" We realized that the same unsettling events had been occurring to her as well. The two of us discussed the strange happenings, trying to make sense of it all. Meanwhile, there was this janitor who worked at the hospital, someone who had always given me an uneasy feeling. There was something peculiar about him. He had an intense fascination with rats, but it went beyond the love and adoration people have for them. He seemed to worship them, proclaiming that humans were the real rats. His obsession with the creatures made me feel uneasy, but out of fear, I tried to make peace with him, always being polite, greeting him whenever I met his presence. Still, he wasn't friendly, only shooting me sarcastic smirks in response. Oftentimes, I felt like he was leaning into his creepiness, trying to create more unease. One morning, driven by curiosity and suspicion, I found myself outside the janitor's closet. As I peered through the slightly ajar door, I witnessed a sight that both terrified and confused me. The janitor was inside, surrounded by a shrine of rat photos and memorabilia, chanting words that I couldn't understand, but I knew them to be Latin. I was much less stealthy as I quickly moved away from the door and back to my area. How was something like this allowed to take place inside a hospital? From that moment on, the activity in the hospital escalated. I couldn't help but feel like it was my fault. I shouldn't have gone snooping. And did he know? The thought scared me, but I remained my normal self, kept up with my greetings, etc. Things continued to go missing, but now, whatever entity was haunting me seemed agitated. It would slam oven doors, knock objects off shelves, all in my presence. I tried my best to set aside my fear and carry on. This wasn't a job I could afford to lose. But then I started hearing a voice that could only be described as demonic. It called my name, taunting me, filling me with a sense of dread like I've never felt in my life. Still, to this day, I've never felt such a feeling, and I survived a major flood in my hometown just 2 years later. This feeling, it goes unmatched. Desperate for answers, I sought out my friend to explain the escalating events. As we spoke, the janitor appeared, staring at us with an intensity that gave us both chills. While walking away, my friend made a comment to the janitor, almost mocking him for his obsession with rats. I don't know why she did this, but right as she did, I grabbed her arm, trying to convey that she should stop. Before he walked away, he turned, cast a malevolent gaze at both of us. Suddenly, the top of the coffee pot in front of us started shaking violently before flying off, landing directly in front of the janitor. Things only got worse from there. A shadow began to manifest, initially appearing in various rooms, but whenever it entered a room, the patient inside would go into a cold blue, often resulting in their demise. It was a horrifying pattern to witness, with the shadow seemingly having a real influence over life and death. Are we the only ones that were seeing this? No, we weren't. One nurse had deemed the hospital haunted, but didn't liken it to the janitor himself. It's always been haunted, she said very nonchalantly. But then there was the doctor that had had a disagreement with the janitor. Moments after their encounter, an obvious and loud one outside of an OR. The doctor, who had been in perfect health, seemed to suddenly collapse to the floor, writhing in pain from kidney stones. It is possible it's completely unrelated, but I didn't like the pattern I was seeing. It was becoming increasingly harder to ignore, increasingly harder to hide my fear. My friend didn't appreciate how scared I had become at work, daily, so instead of taking my advice and ignoring the janitor, she seemed to antagonize him further, telling him to take his voodoo elsewhere. He only laughed, but he would walk by her and shake his hands at her like he was casting some sort of spell, and then would continue laughing as he walked away. My suspicions of the janitor, they grew stronger when he asked me about my friend. He specifically mentioned the rude comment that she had made about rats in his presence. Was he trying to tell me something was wrong with her? Panic consumed me as I frantically searched for my friend. Eventually, I discovered that my friend had experienced a family emergency. The timing and the strange events surrounding it made me question whether the janitor had somehow manifested something evil through his bizarre practices. In the end, overwhelmed by fear and uncertainty, I made the decision to quit my job at that hospital. The experiences I had endured in the presence of the janitor, they tainted my perception of the entire place. As I left, I couldn't help but wonder if the janitor had really unleashed some sort of malevolent force. But I felt extreme relief never stepping foot in there again. Before my grandmother died in 2022, I asked her if I could publish her stories. Not only did she give me permission, but she gave me her journals where she documented a lot of her most interesting experiences. She'd worked at a couple of haunted locations, so much so that I believe my grandmother was sensitive. She never said that, but her experiences aren't ones that I think just everyone has. Don't get me wrong, I've always wanted to experience something paranormal like this. I do believe in this stuff. Like, I know I'd be scared, but the curiosity outweighs the fear. Either way, the story about my grandmother's time working at St. Ignatius Hospital in Colfax, Washington, is one of my favorite stories of hers, so I'm just going to share it in her words instead of trying to rewrite it myself. Oh, also, some things have changed since she initially wrote this. You can actually visit this place. It's been converted into a historical museum. I've not personally been there since I live in Utah, and I have yet to make my way to Washington, but I wanted to throw that out there. Thanks for sharing. The Sisters of Providence. The second hospital I ever worked with, St. Ignatius, was the most active. It wasn't a traditional busyness. The patient population had been diminishing for years. Part of my job was collecting that sort of data, and it was clear St. Ignatius was not a busy hospital, not anymore. Instead, the activity I felt, it was spiritual, residual. By the time they closed as St. Ignatius in 1964, the same year I gave birth to my daughter, Michelle, it was mainly due to a lack of patients there. It was simply too expensive to maintain. But in its heyday, the hospital served as one of the most important healthcare systems in the entire region. I was looking forward to the work I had to do there. I knew the hospital had a lot of history, but the first time I walked in there, I realized just how much of it lived inside those walls still. I could feel it. The air was heavy with the scent of antiseptic, but there was something else lingering there. Something most consider inexplicable. But I had felt the feeling before. Holy Trinity in Palouse, Nani's house in Clarkston. The hospital was haunted. That's when I learned about the Sisters of Providence. Several framed photos throughout the hospital, little statements underneath some of them, plaques sharing the same sentiment. The Sisters of Providence were instrumental in the establishment of St. Ignatius Hospital in Colfax, Washington. They recognized the need for medical care in the area and took the initiative to create the hospital. An incredible statement, though it only tells part of the story. Before I learned everything, I knew enough to know that the presence was likely that of the sisters. As I made my way through mostly vacant hallways, I wasn't frightened, though I did feel slight unease at their quickly vanishing apparitions. These became more frequent the more times I visited and the longer I stayed there. Sure, they meant no harm, but it's something to get used to, undoubtedly. I had the opportunity to venture deeper into the heart of the hospital. Though it was now just mainly archives and a collection of unused spaces, that's where I was given a small workplace to go about my business without encroaching on valuable space necessary to the medical staff. The air was a bit more stale in those places. Goosebumps rose on my arms, and though it was cold, those weren't the response to a change in weather. It was as if whatever had been with me throughout the mainstay hospital had followed me there, too. The sound of distant, steady footsteps echoed through the empty corridors. I knew they weren't the result of anything evil or in despair. There was warmth there, a sense of guardianship. As I delved deeper over the next few hours, I discovered the past. These items in literature weren't the ones out in the open for everyone to find. Instead, tucked away in the unused corridors of the hospital. Old filing cabinets and boxes filled with more photographs, tattered journals, prayer manuals, and other forgotten relics that actually revealed the stories of the nuns. More than just their devotion to their faith, but also how instrumental and connected to that place they were. These sisters, these nuns, were actively involved in the planning and fundraising, as many of the plaques implied, but I found it especially noteworthy that they had participated in the actual construction of the hospital, which opened its doors in 1893. They even continued to manage and provide the healthcare services at St. Ignatius Hospital for many years, ensuring that the community had access to good quality medical care. Many of the sisters spent their final days inside St. Ignatius. It was their home. To this day, I cannot forget that hospital, the sisters that wander its halls. It had a surprisingly profound impact on my life. Their presence serves as a constant reminder that spirits of the past can linger, seeking solace or understanding in the hearts of the living. And though their presence may be unsettling, the human spirit is so powerful, living and beyond. I live in Maine, close to Rumford. There was a man following me on my jog today, around Ellis Pond, but I couldn't wrap my head around how he kept ending up in front of me as I jogged. The first time I noticed him was earlier on my run. My playlist had just started when my mom called. I stopped to answer it. During our 2-minute conversation, I had the chance to stop and look around, really soak in the serene landscape that I was always running through but never really slowed down to appreciate. The sun was close to rising. Far in the trees on the left side of the path, I see a figure walk in between 2 large tree trunks, vanishing when he fully passed behind the second tree. The diameter of this trunk was far too thin for this figure to hide behind. I surely would have seen his shoulders poking out if he was standing behind the tree. When I hung up with my mom, what I saw wasn't there anymore. I jogged a little faster along the path with my headphones off while I scanned the surroundings. I was about halfway complete on my route. It would have taken me longer to backtrack. 10 minutes later, on my left again, I made eye contact with a pure black owl sitting in the trees. The feathers were the deepest of black that I've ever seen on a bird. Its circular yellow eyes were the only thing that gave away its position in the branches. When I finally couldn't crank my neck any further and still keep running, I had to relinquish our staring contest and keep moving. At this point in my jog, the suns just began to glow on the horizon, providing me a bit more light and further visibility. Up ahead of me, the path bends to the right. The tree line follows its bend, so before I make this turn, a patch of trees are directly in front of me, less than a quarter mile ahead. I don't see anything as I approach. I'm just about to let my guard down, but before I turned right, I looked left, and I saw the same dark figure. This time, they were walking between the trees far in the distance. They were much closer, walking towards me. It was a man in all black. He was wearing a ski mask that covered his face because his eyes were the only discernible feature. His face was a blank canvas. When I turned and saw him, he picked up his speed and started charging through the trees at me. The feeling gripped me with such shock, but I was able to scream. My legs became jelly, though, and I collapsed onto the ground in fright, tucked into a tight ball. I heard his shoes cross from the grass onto the concrete, sprinting my way. I continued screaming as loud as I could, curled up in a fetal position for a while, before realizing I hadn't even been touched yet. I move my arms away from my face, and I see that the man is no longer there. I sit up, and I'm once again all alone on the path. I try to stand while I'm still shaking with fear, thinking this guy could have ducked behind one of these trees, that he's waiting to attack me again. But why would he have prolonged his attack? The sun was almost up, and the chances of someone else coming on this path was only increasing now. I wasn't going to wait and find out, though. I ran the last mile as fast as I could to get to my car. I didn't see the man again. This is a popular trail, and that's why I like to get my workout in early before other people started showing up. But now I don't think that I'll mind the extra company on the walking trails during my workout. It was the realization that something bad could have happened and nobody would have known. My roommates know my route, but they wouldn't have noticed that I disappeared until they got home from work that night, maybe even the next day. Before my family moved out to Provincetown, we lived in Boston. My dad, Cam, had just returned from the war. We visited Provincetown on vacation many times previously, but after service, Dad had a new perspective and appreciation for life. I know my mom and I were elated at the idea, and one weekend, me, my parents, and our basset hound named Bomber all hopped into our green Cadillac Coupe de Ville and drove out to Provincetown, looking for a property to purchase. Mom packed us a large picnic that we would enjoy when we got into town. There's a wildlife refuge in Painter's Pond off Highway 6. It has a beautiful park with a canopy of tree coverage to escape the sun that had been bearing down that summer day. It was a perfect place for a picnic. Dad brought his fishing pole and went down to the pond to cast a line, while my mom began to set up the picnic. I stayed back with my mom and sat in the grass under a tree, holding her Lucky Strike while she spread the blanket out and unpacked the basket on top of it. Bomber was lying next to me. I enjoyed the smell of my mom's cigarettes, and so I was holding it straight up and down, kinda close to my chest under my chin area. Every time a small gust of wind would blow by, I'd get a nice smell of that burning tobacco. As the blanket slowly filled with delicious food, the cigarette pinched between my pointer finger and thumb slowly became a tower of ash, and that smoldering tower would get blown over by an especially dramatic gust of wind falling into Bomber's back. He's asleep, but when the hot ash hits him, he leaps up with a yip-yip and bolts into the woods behind us. Mom says, "You better go catch him." So I stood up in a hurry, dropped the cigarette, and turned on my heels. I was a speedy girl back then, and Bomber's hound legs didn't get him going very fast, so I was catching up good. Then, when I was less than 10 feet from him, this white, translucent spinning ring opened in front of us. It opened about 6 feet tall. Some of the circle was in the ground, but not disturbing the ground, just passing through it. I stopped in my tracks. I'm screaming, "Bomber, Bomber, come back!" But he keeps running towards this thing. Through the hoop, on the other side, looked identical to the forest ahead of me, but the trees were darker. It looked like a different time of day than it did outside the ring. I watched Bomber pass right through while running. I'm about to start chasing after him again, but this loud, zoom, crackling noise shakes the trees around me, and the ring squeezes into the size of a pinhole, and then fully disappears into nothing again. Except Bomber's gone. I no longer see or hear his paws running through the leaves and sticks. The high-pitched clinking of his collar and tags that could usually be heard from all around were suddenly absent. I start calling his name again, but the forest is quiet. I still can't begin to explain what I saw that day, and when I ran back to tell my mom what happened, I knew she wasn't going to be able to understand what I witnessed. She thought that he was just lost, most likely within a 50-yard proximity. She told my dad, and they both took up the search for a good hour before deciding to pick it up again after lunch. Dad tried to reassure me that he would probably be back before the picnic was over. Hound dogs have a great nose. He'll smell the picnic and come hightailing it back before we're done. But Bomber never did. Eventually, we had to leave. At the welcome station, my dad put up a handwritten missing poster describing Bomber and how to get a hold of us. We all loved that dog, and the rest of the trip was a lot more somber than you'd hope for while house hunting. My mom and dad did manage to find us a beautiful house on Commercial Street that I'd grow up in. Over the years, I fell in love with that town. Out of high school, my friend Wendy and I got internships at the Chamber of Commerce. Then we ended up getting hired as a program coordinator and event planner. That's how I got the job into retirement and where I met my late husband, Nord. Our front desk woman wasn't there that day, and Nord came in wearing his ranger suit with a stack of papers he needed me to file. After a couple flips of my long brunette hair, he asked me out. Years later, Nord and I were living together, and I was 6 months pregnant with our first daughter. We were living in a house that the wildlife refuge provided to the park rangers so that they could be on site at all times. It was about dinner time, and I was just taking dinner out of the oven when suddenly the landline rings. That line is reserved specifically for the parks department. Nord rolls his eyes before he leans back in his chair to pick up the phone. When he answers, the look on his face stays unimpressed, and after the conversation, Nord is visibly irritated that he has to hold off on dinner. Whatever the conversation consisted of resulted in him needing to take immediate action, but the situation probably wasn't a dire one. And I got all that just from a look. Nord pulls up his boots and says that he'll be back. He's got to go check on something at the camping area. He says he'll be quick, so don't put everything away yet. I say all right, and he leaves. It's only been a few minutes when I hear his truck pulling back into the driveway. Nord comes in through the front door, smiling, excited to eat. We sat at the table and started dishing our plates up, and I tell him that was quick. Nord says, yeah, but the job's not done yet. He's still got to drive the guy to the shelter, but he fell asleep in the back seat, so he thought he had a minute to stop in before the food got cold. I had so many questions. This guy? What do you mean by this guy? Is there a homeless man sleeping in your truck right now? Nord laughs and says no. Campers reported a stray dog running around their campsite, begging for food. After everyone realized that nobody owned the dog, they found a way to coax it to the welcome station. I said, "Aw, that's a shame. What kind of dog?" By this point in my life, decades had passed since the loss of my dog. Multiple animals had come and gone since, but the pain all came rushing back when he told me that it was a hound dog. And I had to make that evening's dinner conversation a sad one when I told him about my childhood loss. Now, after dinner, before Nord gets ready to leave again, I ask him if I could see the dog. He says sure, and we grab some scraps to feed him before heading to the truck. When Nord opens the back door, the dog's awake and patiently sitting in the back seat. His tail wags when he smells the food, and we lay it down on the seat next to him. The interior of the truck is mostly dark, and Nord steps back a few feet to turn on his flashlight. When he does, I get chills on my arms when I see that this dog looks identical to the one I had growing up. Identical to the point it made me choke up with tears. Same size, even the same spot placement. Nord whistles a quiet whistle, and the dog's saggy face turns up, and I hear the gentlest tink-tink. The collar he's wearing has a single tag on it that reads, Bomber. I couldn't believe my eyes. I was almost more spooked than overwhelmed with feelings. I start saying, "Holy shit, Nord. This dog's name is Bomber. What are the odds of that?" We both agreed that it was weird, but we also immediately agreed that we're obviously keeping the dog. And that's how I adopted Bomber number 2. Do I think he was my Bomber? In reality, my Bomber would have been much older, if not dead, by that time. I'd lost him when I was around 7, and bomber number 2 showed up when I was in my late 20s, and he was a young dog. My kids were almost in high school by the time bomber 2 passed. By that time, he was an old hound dog that could barely walk, but he was always the goodest boy. Was he a time-traveling goodest boy? I guess that's a secret he took to doggy heaven. I may be a fully grown adult female now, but I have had a crippling fear of doctors, especially surgeons, since I was a teenager. I got this fear because my best friend died when we were 14, and my family doesn't believe in therapy, just smiling. Dee was born with a lot of health issues, so she was always sickly growing up, but things got really bad in 8th grade. I was staying the night with her when things got so bad that she had to go to the hospital at 2 a.m. The doctors took a lot of blood and ran various tests, only to determine that she had appendicitis. They took her into surgery, promising the procedure was completely routine, should only take about an hour. Her mother Penny and I sat in the waiting room and played cards to pass the time, but an hour came and went without any updates. Only after Penny begged the nurse to check on Dee did one of the doctors come to speak to her. The procedure was a success, but Dee's condition didn't improve. Now her kidneys were failing, and the doctor rushed her back into surgery without answering any more questions. Within the next 20 minutes, Dee's entire family was there helping her raise hell. Her aunt was a nurse and said the whole situation reeked of a screw-up. 2 hours later, we got the news. Dee was gone. That was one of the darkest nights of my life. I had just been holding her hand before the surgery, joking about how much we would play up the whole experience into something melodramatic once we got back to school. Her parents hired a lawyer, and we learned that there was never a problem with Dee's appendix at all. When they opened her up, it was completely fine, but they took it out anyway. The stress her body endured exacerbated her actual problem, her failing kidneys. They removed one and were in the process of removing the second when she passed away. Fast forward a year. I'm in 9th grade, and my arch nemesis is a girl named Hillary. She was the cliché, bitchy, popular type, and her mom happened to be a nurse at the hospital where Dee had passed away. Well, Hillary started telling everyone that Dee's ghost was haunting the operating floor. Her mom saw her. I was pissed. I was a full-blown hardcore skeptic, and no words were going to convince me that Hillary wasn't just using Dee to garner attention. I walked right into the circle of girls, pushed Hillary into a locker, and promised to knock her teeth out if she ever said Dee's name again. She swore she was telling the truth. So I hit her, and then 4 other girls jumped on my back and beat the shit out of me. They tried to suspend me for breaking Hillary's nose. I missed her front teeth, but I was covered in bruises, and my lip was swollen from the other 4 girls, so my parents demanded they also be suspended. Obviously, the school didn't want to suspend their cheerleaders, so none of us were suspended. Instead, we got a stern talking to. Over the years, random stories would spread of people seeing Dee's ghost, and I always blamed Hillary for starting the rumor in the first place. We gave each other hell all the way through graduation, and I celebrated the last time I'd have to see her. Now, fast forward again, 2 years ago. I went home for Christmas and got T-boned by a Charger running a red light. The ride to the hospital was a blur, but I needed emergency surgery. Afterwards, I was taken to a recovery room where I slowly began regaining consciousness. Before I opened my eyes, I became aware of someone sitting on the bed, holding my hand. Thinking it was my mother, I opened my eyes to see Dee smiling at me. All I could do was stare in shocked silence until she disappeared. A nurse came in a moment later and shook me back to reality. She was also my best friend during our junior and senior year of high school and wanted to be there when I woke up. I probably wouldn't have said anything if it had been a stranger, but as soon as I realized my nurse was Lizzie, it just spilled out of me. The way she looked at me made me think that I'd been having some sort of hallucination from all the drugs. But then she said that she had seen Dee too. Most of the nurses had. When she learned I was on the floor, she asked the staff not to mention Dee because of my history with Hillary. She didn't want anyone to upset me by mistake. Apparently, Dee often checks in on patients coming in and out of surgery, and sometimes while they're still in surgery. But they've never heard of her sitting on anyone's bed or holding their hand. All that time, it was true, but I just couldn't believe it. Every time I've gone home since, I stop and have lunch with Lizzie, and I like to think that Dee comes too. Well, friends, it appears we've reached the end of tonight's episode. Thanks for joining me. Whether it's your first time or you're a regular, your support means the world over here. We've got brand new episodes every Friday night. Keep those eyes open long enough for those deep sleep videos, and of course, double features. Subscribe, tap the bell, and you'll never miss a thing. Big thanks to those who shared their stories, and a huge shout out to all of our patrons, whom we appreciate so very much. Tracy S, Tamara K, Monica L, ZoeWatt, Chelle B, Donald C, The Dark Cosmos, Marion T, Rat Girl, Alisha S, Erin G, Nikki H, Mr. Revenant, Naz K, Brendon G, Paul T, Nicholas C, Lissane, Arlene F, and Adrienne. If you want to support the Darkest Hour in other ways, consider joining our Patreon. Check out patreon.com/thedarkesthour, or click the link in the description to learn more. Do you have stories like these? I'd love to share them. Send them to me, amandadarkesthour@gmail.com, or on the Darkest Hour subreddit, The Darkest Hour YT. Stay spooky.